Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the summer edition of the RFK Human Rights Book Club. My name is Lynn Delaney. I'm the executive director, and I've been with the organization for several decades now, and this remains one of my very favorite activities of the organization, as it has been inspired by our annual book and journalism awards, which have been going on for nearly half a century. Special thanks to Nisa Patel. This was kind of her brainchild, as she was so inspired by our awards and wanted to make sure we had a mechanism for sharing the winning selections with a greater audience. And thank you to Bellina Pristina for coordinating this award. I'm sorry, Bellina. I'm going to quickly tell you a little bit about the book award. It was founded 45 years ago by historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr., with the proceeds from his biography, Robert F. Kennedy and His Times. Highly recommended. It's a little hard to find. You can find it in paperback. It's a big volume, but it's a terrific book. It's not just a biography of Robert Kennedy, but it's a complete picture of that era and that pivotal time in our American history. Our book awards are currently chaired by presidential historian and author Michael Beschloss, who you can also see quite frequently on MSNBC. We are very proud to feature this year's winner. The award was just presented in May to Blair LM Kelley for Black Folk, The Roots of the Black Working Class. It's a terrific book, and Blair brings a personal perspective to it as the history is told to us through generations of her own family. The selection was made by our esteemed panel of judges. This year, the judges were Pulitzer Prize winner and author Annette Gordon-Reed, former Washington Post and New York Times editor Bill Hamilton, and historian and author Ted Widmer. We're very fortunate today to have Ted with us as our moderator. He's not only a historian and an author, but is also a former presidential advisor. He writes widely on history and politics, and he was a speechwriter and senior advisor to President William Clinton, and also a senior advisor to Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. In 2020, Ted wrote Lincoln on the Verge, 13 Days to Washington, in addition to 6 other books that he has written or edited. His next project is a study of racial tension in Boston in 1968. He is the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship to do that work. We look forward to seeing what he produces on that project. He's a Harvard grad and has directed research centers at the Library of Congress, Brown University, and Washington College. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Ted. Thank you for joining us, Ted.
Thank you, Lynn. What a lovely introduction. Great to be here with all of you. And I should add, with that project coming up about 1968, an important chapter will be about Robert Kennedy and the extraordinary speeches he was giving in the spring of 1968, particularly over the weekend following the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So Robert Kennedy is in my research and in my life in many ways, and it's really a joy to be on the jury for the book prize. We read the most interesting products of new scholarship, and this year it was our great joy to give the RFK Book Prize to Blair LM Kelley for Black Folk, The Roots of the Black Working Class. And you don't need to hear me talk about it because she's here with us. So let me introduce her. Blair LM Kelley is the Williamson Distinguished Professor of Southern Studies, Director of the Center for the Study of the American South, and co-director of the Southern Futures Initiative at the University of North Carolina. Her first book, Right to Ride, Streetcar Boycotts and African-American Citizenship in the Era of Plessy versus Ferguson, won the Letitia Woods Brown Memorial Book Award, and she's also received fellowships, a Whiting Award and a John Hope Franklin NEH Fellowship from the National Humanities Center to support her writing of Black folk. So welcome, Blair, if it's okay to go on a first name basis. And
absolutely, of course.
And thank you for writing this wonderful book, which I enjoyed so much. And I've actually never after a few years of being on this jury, I've never had a conversation with a winner. So this is a first for me.
Okay, awesome.
So maybe you could just tell our listeners where this book came from. It's very deep, obviously. I mean, it's your whole life and many generations of your family before you. But when did it really start to become a book for you?
So it really started as a question. And my editor, had seen a lot of the work on the white working class. JD Vance, of course, is in the center of the news right now. I think, and he really kicked off a moment where there was a lot of interest in the white working class in America. And so my editor was thinking that, wouldn't it be important to write about the Black working class? And I sat with the question for a while. There's a sense that there isn't just quite a parallel between Black life and white life. It's not that you can just sort of tack them both together and they have the same signposts in history. There really is a unique journey. And when I thought about the journey, a good working class historian would not be talking about enslavement. They would be talking about, post-slavery. But when I thought about it, what makes the Black working class unique begins in the moment of enslavement, because there's this upbuilding of culture and community and resilience that people need to survive. And there's also a period of learning and knowledge and observation about the world and the world of work that happens before they enter that world, so that when they become free, they actually already have strategy and an approach and a collectivity that provides a basis of strength. And, I learned a lot of this from my own family. I always, as a historian, was trained not to talk about my own family very specifically. But in writing for trade, you want to have that personal touch. And I'd always used my family as a way to think about the past. I would always sort of benchmark it against the relatives that I knew and the stories that they told me. And this gave me the chance to really just bring those stories that were always in my heart forward to my readers. And it was just, I feel very fortunate to be able to meld, the two, both the personal and the historical into one narrative.
I thought you combined them beautifully. And as I was reading it, I wondered why more historians don't add more of the personal, because it really works. And you did it in such a graceful way. You're in there a little bit at the beginning, but it's more your relatives, your ancestors. But then you're really there at the end. And it's beautiful how you show up. And of course you've been there with us all along, but it's great to really see you at the end. As a little girl with your grandmother. But I just thought it was so skillfully done. So how did you manage to combine the personal and the deep research in a way that felt right to you? I thought it was not, it was just the balance was perfect, it seemed to me.
Like I said, I think I always used, my folks as a test. So if I was reading about the migration, I'd be like, well, my grandmother actually came a little later than that, and this is what she experienced. And so, I was always just mentally plumbing the stories, the experiences that they had shared with me about them, about their ancestors, about their parents and their grandparents. And I'd also done a lot of work on ancestry just for fun. You can tell I'm a real historical nerd that, like, in my spare time, I look at census documents and death certificates. And so I had built up a pretty intricate family tree over the years, probably over about 12 years I've been doing that work, just for fun. And so when I began to think about like how I would write the book, I was like, well, let me push a little bit on my grandfather's side of the family tree and see how far I can get into Georgia. And I happened upon Henry and a treasure trove of documents that really just enlivened the story for me. And so as I moved through, it was almost like the stories came to me the way that they were supposed to be. Finding a washerwoman who happened to be from the same place as my ancestors had been enslaved, who moves and then has a very beautiful story. finding a race massacre in Accomack, Virginia, where my grandfather is from. And I knew nothing about Accomack other than it was very rural and very old. And so all of these little threads began to work well, finding the oral history of a woman who ran away from Accomack around the same time as my grandfather.
Mm-hmm.
And so all of that made me start to feel like the book project was bigger than me.
Mm-hmm.
That I was a vessel for telling a story that worked well and was interweaved with my own ancestors' experiences in really substantive ways, and taught me a lot about what I knew to be true, but gave me that sort of archival and factual backing to lift up my family, who are not extraordinary in any traditional historical way, but that all our stories are extraordinary if we study them.
Well, what I appreciate you're saying, your family is not extraordinary in some ways, and that's a part of the appeal of the book. We can all relate to it, but your writing is extraordinary, and little touches like the way your grandmother squeezed your hand. It's really very well written, which I'm not used to reading good writing in a history book, even though I am a historian. But there's a kind of factual, dry way of writing a history book, and you got beyond that in a very good way with this book. So, how did you find the courage to write in a pretty descriptive way?
Well, in undergrad, I trained as a poet. I took a lot of poetry writing. I read a lot of poetry. I took enough courses to almost have an English major, but I didn't want to do the Shakespeare two-part thing because I already had a history major and an African American studies major, and I was like, that's enough. I studied with Rita Dove, who to me is an incredible, not only an incredible poet, of course, but an incredible historian on her own right. And she taught us so much about the archival research she did just to write simple things. And so I wrote a bunch of historical poems as an undergrad. And then I was like, well, I'm probably not going to be a poet. I'm a better historian. Let me just move on. But the interest in the beauty of the language and compelling storytelling, it was always there. And so even though I think historians are not encouraged to do that work, a big part of what I wanted to do with Black folk was to make sure that historians are entering this space to tell about our past in important ways. I think so often historians write for one another. We're going to conferences and we're presenting to each other, and we're excited about sort of the inside baseball of what we do.
Right.
But when you ask folks, who their favorite historians are, they're going to say Isabel Wilkerson and the folks who write big sweeping, Annette Gordon Reed, going to say those big sweeping histories that traditional historians in the academy aren't writing. And so I wanted to change that. I loved being a part of the academy. I love being a professor, but I also want to have folks learn from what I know and what we've gleaned over time. And so marrying the two is a big goal of mine. And I'm very glad that it worked. But you have to write beautifully in order for that to land. You have to write in a way that doesn't feel heavy or archival. If you want that, you can go to the footnotes and you can plumb my footnotes, my endnotes. But I wanted it to read in a way that felt easy and enjoyable.
Even the first line, I have it right here. The sound of his father's voice at a whisper startled him out of his sleep. That's a better line than you read in most history. It's got sounds in it, and in other parts of the book, you have a lot of visual descriptions, sights, sounds, smells of a kitchen. I wish I'm just really grateful to you, and I wish more of us in the history profession thought that way. It's fascinating about the poetry in your background. You mentioned Isabel Wilkerson. Was she a big influence on you when you were writing this book?
I think so. I love being on social media, and I loved being on the platform formerly known as Twitter. And one day I just asked folks, I said, well, what's your favorite history book? And everybody, Warmth of Other Suns, just poured in from every direction. And I think, it's good history, but it's beautiful storytelling.
Right.
And it sticks with you. And
right.
and the folks that she's introducing you to become part of your own thinking about the world. And so that was an inspiration for me. Absolutely. Just to write in that way. And you know, in addition to I'm inspired by the traditional historians who have written in that way. Robin D.G. Kelley, Tara Hunter are my two favorite historians. And, you know, I've been learning from them my whole career. And just, you know, bridging those worlds is so important for me. I want folks like the people I'm writing about to be able to read my book and to enjoy it and not to get weighed down in the heaviness of a historical inside argument about theory and who said what when, but instead really see themselves and see their history elevated to be something of meaning and consequence. And this is not to say that theory's not in there. It's just my job to make sure that the theory reads like beautiful prose.
Mm-hmm. The Warmth of Other Suns is about the Great Migration. I got a vivid feel for what it meant in your book and how incremental the progress was. So getting to Philadelphia was a big deal, but it didn't solve everything. It you know, was just constant work for every generation.
Yeah. So often we're telling this story in sort of segmented ways as if things are all left behind once you move through this next stage of the historical epoch. And so when I've taught, I've always taught my students, you know, that these are generational shifts that take a lot out of the people who do that work. You know, the moment of moving north and finding community and building again, it's so hard. It's grating around housing and employment and unions that won't allow Black members. And you know, they really worked for every bit of the change that comes. And so that by the time you get to the civil rights movement, there's a strength there in that community, but it's hard fought. And I wanted to make sure that people felt both the fight, but also the value that was in those everyday folks doing simple jobs that we take for granted.
Yep.
There's a connection, there's meaning, and then there's intelligence, there's strategy in the everyday.
You know, you're always thinking about a lot of things when you're reading a book. And I mean, I actually read this a few months ago before our jury, but then I reread it over the last week because I knew I would be speaking with you. And unions are very strong in your book. The Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. What a crucial achievement it was for them to get that union off the ground. And then as the AFL kind of slowly, but did finally come around to recognizing their fellow union members, that was good for both sides, I would say.
Absolutely. And I think, you know, the power of workers coming together was so choked by the question of race in our country for so many generations. And so I wanted to be clear that Black unionizing is its own thing. And that they weren't necessarily waiting on someone to teach them or tell them or bring them in. If they were rejected, they built their own. And, you know, the most powerful union I encountered was probably the most tiny and the one that I have the least information about, but the washerwomen of Jackson, Mississippi, who come together in 1866.
Wow.
To organize. You know, the moment of freedom for them was also a moment of organizing. And they had strategy and a sense of where they could be in a market.
Right.
As women workers who just had become free was just such a powerful example of the innate knowledge of the enslaved.
And you have an arresting line about the high percentage of African Americans in unions today, which made me think about the presidential election we're heading into that, you know, changing rather rapidly. But
yes,
unions will be very important to this election. We saw the Teamsters at the Republican convention, but a whole lot of unions are now coming behind Kamala. So I felt like I was reading your book and thinking about unions in 2024 at the same time.
yeah, absolutely. I think that, you know, African Americans are in the South, which is the region that's most hostile to unionizing in the country. And yet you see so much activism and excitement and possibility within those communities. The forming folks who are trying to form new unions, join new unions, the Fight for 15 here in North Carolina was so active. SEIU, service workers unions, so many different spaces are the folks who are working in Walmarts and Amazon factories, Starbucks. There's a whole range of new activism that's happening post-pandemic, particularly that I think is exciting, and it builds on these traditions. It builds on folks whose parents and grandparents were also active and organized, and so there's a basis there for what we're seeing in this particular moment.
One thing I got excited by, and I thought you did it really well, was you bring us up to the beginnings of the civil rights movement that we're familiar with, most of us, Montgomery boycott, 1955, and then the 60s. But you show how the layers of all of these practices, these cultural practices and actual labor organizations laid the groundwork for the very successful community resistance in a place like Montgomery. And so all your previous writing puts the reader at the beginning of the civil rights movement, and you realize how much has already happened to make it possible.
Yeah, absolutely. That sense that civil rights really has a groundwork in the first moments of freedom, and that the generation after generation is building on what has come before. I think it's such an important reminder for us in this particular moment when we feel a bit beleaguered by the erosion of rights. Is
Right.
that there's no memory that it took generations, that it took
Right.
Decade after decade of organizing and activism and building, that it was bigger than just voting and showing up for an election. It was really that community connection, the networks, the ability of people just to say, no, I won't be part of that, or I will sacrifice to support a boycott or a protest. It's really incredible for us to remember the layers of labor that are required
Right.
to get rights and probably to keep them.
Because of you, I think of Rosa Parks a little differently. I think it's important that she was a seamstress, which I hadn't really thought about. Or you're great on the mailmen who were helping to give people rides, and your chapter on the postal workers, just great. We see them all the time. We don't really think about their history.
Yes.
And they're important to this country.
My mother always had a habit of pointing out what were good jobs. She would say, well, it used to be somebody on the elevator who would move you to your floor. That was a good job. And at the post office, that was a really good job, because that was a federal job, and you had benefits, and you couldn't be fired by local people. That was a really good job. And so she just always was pointing out those little moments. The Pullman porters, she talked, at length about how incredible they were as leaders, as people who knowledge access. Yes, they had polish, right? They were
Right.
They were educated and connected and really, providing an infrastructure for the community as a whole. So she was always pointing out, things that were no longer in existence, but, had provided a gateway for that first generation to have nice jobs that moved us forward as a community. She wanted me to be connected to that. She was a bit of an older mother at the time. Now women have children at the age that she had me all the time. But at the time, most women were having their babies in their late teens, early 20s. And so she was well in her 30s. And so I think she wanted me to feel connected to her generation. She felt like a lot had changed in her lifetime. And she wanted me to be knowledgeable about what the world looked like. And so I think that's why I have that sort of proclivity for a rich textural way of thinking about the past.
When you think about how important the sleeping car porters were, it might be possible to argue that the decline of the railroad was a bad thing for African Americans, although I think you could also say the increase of car ownership was probably a good thing too, but there was great power in that particular union and great pride.
Yes.
And so something did disappear when train service just kind of fell apart in this country.
Yeah, I mean, it's an accidental coalition, built out of the racism of George Mortimer Pullman, who wanted to have Black men working on train cars to give white riders that sort of antebellum sense that they had a Black manservant waiting on them hand and foot. And so that, that's not an admirable set of thoughts. And yet he ends up being the largest private employer of Black men in the country. And together they collectively are able, despite the resistance of the company, to build something really phenomenal that then is the building block for civil rights. I don't think we are where we are as a country without the work that they did for generations to really make a difference. And so, yes, losing that is something to think about. And that's why I wanted to write about the post office, because I think we're at a moment where we could lose the post office as we know it. There's been a real campaign to degrade postal employment, to say it's some kind of failure. But it's really structural things that folks who are against the public engagement around the post office are trying to deconstruct, and they make a narrative based around those things that aren't really true. And so that's also a space where civil rights was born.
Right.
And where our rights can be defended and protected, and it's constitutional. We have to think about the power of a working class profession embedded in the Constitution. We don't have much in there that is that way, but it's really a powerful connector for so many communities to have a postal worker, and then the knowledge and community that's built in their ranks. It's
literally a way of connecting Americans to each other.
Yes.
Sending and receiving mail.
Yes, it's really, it was a real joy and pleasure to sit with it and sit with that history and read all these articles of people who really had to fight to get a job at the post office. That it wasn't simple or straightforward. I learned so much. I knew it, and then as I did the research to really dive into the stories, it was astounding how hard people had to fight just to get a job at the post office. Something we take for granted now.
Can you remind me what the Constitution says about delivering the mail? I can't remember.
It's just constitutionally guaranteed, right? And then the Congress over and over again, before the end of enslavement, passed laws saying that only white men could have those jobs. Really profound. So that the very first Black male postal workers are Civil War veterans. It's something.
You mentioned your mother saying a federal job was a really good job, and it seems like that was an important part of your family's success. When your grandmother got that Navy job in Philadelphia, that was a better job than she had known earlier.
Yes.
It's so different from the way a lot of Americans think a federal job is somehow like the deep state of the federal government is taking away our rights. And in your story, a good federal job confers rights and status in a very important way.
Yes, without the Philadelphia Navy Yard, I wouldn't be here. My parents met at the Philadelphia Navy Yard when my mother was in the typing pool, working in the summer while she was going to Howard. She met my dad, who had been a ship fitter, and then worked his way up the ranks there. So they met on the bus, and evidently my dad was like, "That's going to be my wife," and my mother's like, "He's all right." But it was a place where that very first generation of migrants, Black migrants from the South, could not work. They had to fight for access, fight for jobs, fight for inclusion. And so I think part of the narrative of why we don't like federal jobs is the fairness, the equity that's built into it, and the ability of people to rise over time. So I don't think there's any accident that we're attacking the structures of federal government, because it's overrepresented in the ranks of diverse people in comparison to private employment.
Well, for anyone who has worked in the federal government, as I have a few times, you get the feeling of the great pride of the federal employees in their country and in the diversity of the federal workforce. There are a lot of African Americans in middle and senior level jobs in the federal government, and everyone is very proud of that.
Yeah, it's one of the first places where people could find equity and get a promotion and have a fair shot take a test and get entry into opportunity that wasn't discriminatory, but that was fought for. That was, the work of A. Philip Randolph. That was the work of
Right.
NAACP. That was, deliberate in seeking that fair inclusion. But now that we have it, it's important to consider and protect and defend.
So were you always listening to stories about your family as a child, and or did you learn a lot more for this project?
I heard a lot of it as a child. I'm an only, and my parents were older, and I spent a lot of time with my grandparents, and they were all storytellers. They would all, hit you with a yarn. My grandfather loved to try to make you laugh with something that he did in the past, something crazy, bunch of stuff I didn't even put in the book. But I listened. I was always a big listener. I think it's no accident that I became an oral historian because I really love old stories. I love to hear from people. I love to know more about the detail and the texture of their everyday life. And as a historian, I always want to be able to get on somebody's shoulder and see the world from their point of view. And those stories that my folks told me, did a lot of that. But there were things that I didn't know. I think, my parents and my grandparents wanted to shield me from some of the hardest things that they survived. Discovering that my grandmother had a sister and a brother-in-law and a niece and nephew who all died of tuberculosis before she was 21 was a shock to me. I don't think anybody in my family knew of this other sister who died very young. And so there were things that I discovered in the census and the archive that were a surprise to me as well. And I understand, the desire to protect and to keep me from thinking that the world is really hard. And so it was quite something to discover the things that were unspoken too.
You mentioned Ancestry a few minutes ago, and I've never used it as a
I'm an ancestry
historian.
addict.
So it
I need
doesn't
an
have,
endorsement deal.
but they do have powerful search tools,
They do.
always getting more powerful.
Yes.
So was it pretty useful for you?
It was extremely useful, especially as I wrote a lot of this book in 2020 when many libraries were closed down. And so I didn't have access to some of the archives that I would have gone to until the end of the book research process. And so I love to know as much as I can about each and every person that I'm writing about. So I would build a tree, a family tree on everybody. So I have 26 family trees down in my Ancestry account because if I encountered somebody historically that I'm like, well, this is interesting. Let me see if I can find them in the census. And I would just pop up a tree. Now I can do a better tree if I know more details from the person. So if an oral history account mentioned different names and families and, parents' names or husbands and children's names, then that was helpful in tracing. If I just have one name, it's harder. But often if they had an unusual name or a particular kind of name, they're easier to find. And so I'll pop a tree on everybody. And it is a great tool. They're always looking for more documents. They're always adding more things in. And so even sometimes when things look dry and fruitful, there could be some documents loaded in. And it just really provides a great context, a great starting point for thinking about people's lives.
I did a book a few years ago. I think Lynn mentioned it. It's about Lincoln's train trip from Illinois to Washington to become president. And I really needed to look at local newspapers for every small town he went through, probably 2,000 towns. And there is a search tool called Chronicling America.
Yes.
Paid for by the NEH. And it's just, you can do research from your home that would have taken you decades to do only 10 years ago. And so I'm going to check out Ancestry. I've never done work on it, but I will.
Yeah, it's powerful. On my first book project, I had microfilm and you load that microfilm on, just crank day by day. And so I was looking for records and protests, with no search tools at all other than my hand. And so it was a big sea change between the first book and the second book.
I've enjoyed Henry Louis Gates's shows about finding your ancestors. And would you say there's a rise in interest in family history in the African American community?
I mean, we're so disconnected, right?
Yeah.
Most of us can never get past the 1870 census because as enslaved people, the enslaved were not listed by name on most of the slave schedules. They would be listed by maybe color and age.
Mm-hmm.
And so you'd have to, really read into the very scant documentation that exists. But, finding my ancestor in a will was, something I know from my good training that he was unlikely to appear there. The person who held him in bondage owned hundreds of people and would not have listed all of them by name. But because Henry had been a blacksmith, he popped out. When I found the will, I was like, he's not going to be in there. Don't read it. You're wasting your time. You have stuff to do. And then something in my heart would say, go ahead and read it. And then just to find it there was incredible.
That's so great.
But most folks don't have those little bits and pieces even. They would be gone. My other ancestors who were held in bondage, I don't have those kinds of documents for. So unless they were free, you really can't see very few. But people want to know as much as they can. And so a lot of the questions I get when I do book talks are about doing genealogical work and what we can find and what we can know. One of my favorite tips is that death certificates are oftentimes rich contextual things that can push you a little farther back into the past, because the person who's sharing information upon someone's death often has a family history that then does simply get documented in that death certificate and can be an important bridge just to push past 1870.
Will you bring some of this into your teaching? Because I could see your students just going crazy and doing their own family histories, and it would be a fantastic thing.
Yeah, I have participated with a class that was using this kind of documentation to talk about lynchings, and to trace who had been lynched and to figure out who they were as whole. Because oftentimes we just had that name and not the details of them in community and as a whole living person. And so I do think there's a lot of interest and excitement in making sure we're using these new tools and teaching students how to use them. And so I just spoke with a group of students last week, and most of their questions were about genealogical research and research in general, because they're just so stimulated and excited.
Did you drive around Georgia and South Carolina into those counties?
Yes, some, but again, some of this time was the pandemic, and so I didn't do as much as I had wanted to. But so I'm thankful for the electronic things, because it was harder to do because everybody was shut, and libraries were slow to open.
Yeah. I also appreciated your photographs, your images were so well chosen. A lot from the New Deal era and the history work that was being done, interviewing even older people from, in some cases, who could remember slavery. But the way you dropped in the images really fed the narrative, I thought. Did you work hard on that?
I did. I along with one of my former students, who's a librarian and an oral historian himself, we really combed through images, and he helped me with permissions and figuring out where I could find things. And I love doing that. I wish there was more space and more time to do even more. And I'm excited to be able to work on a coffee table book about emancipation right now. That's my current.
Oh, fantastic.
So I'm getting to work on pictures some more. So it's also another puzzle, because there's so few images of African Americans, and you want ones that are substantive and add to the story. And so there's some really phenomenal collections that I was able to use and plumb that were incredible.
So is the coffee table book coming? Is it on?
It's on
Emancipation Proclamation, or is it in one area?
It's called Jubilee, Juneteenth and Emancipation Day celebrations to focus on the ways in which Juneteenth is the most famous and iconic of the Emancipation Day celebrations that lives on, but that there are Emancipation Day celebrations that happen all across the country. And so I wanted to pull those documents together, given that Juneteenth is giving us new attention to this moment of freedom and the ways in which it was celebrated. I wrote about it, Emancipation Day celebrations, as gateways for protest.
Mhm.
my first book. And so I knew a little bit about them in that time period, and I just wanted to expand that. So I'm excited. I'm almost close to turning it in.
I, I'm sure you've met or read the work of Annette Gordon-Reed, but she was fellow member of the jury that gave you this prize, and she's done fantastic work on Juneteenth.
Yes, she has a wonderful book on it, and that was my starting point for reading. But she's been a real guidepost for my work. I went to the University of Virginia, so her work on the Hemingses of Monticello was
Yeah, it's
groundbreaking and life-changing
so
for me.
important. And you have a nice description of the academical village at UVA and how we need to remember the Black working class when we're walking through there. I thought that was very powerful.
It was what I thought about when I was in that space.
Mhm.
Oftentimes I felt a little bit out of place at the University of Virginia, and then I would go down to the central part of grounds, and I would walk on those bricks, and I would think, well, they were here, so I can be here. I belong here just as much as anybody else
I
because of their
mean, that's
work
what
in that space.
this
Thank you.
book feels like. Your whole life is in it, including what you just said, but your childhood. And I love the photo of you with your grandmother when you're just a little girl. We all have strong family memories, and my family is very different from yours, but I found myself thinking about them a lot too while reading it.
Yeah, the picture with my grandmother is at I believe an Easter celebration.
Mhm.
If you at the bottom of the picture is her china, and it's a grapefruit with a little cherry in the middle, and she had her grapefruit spoons, and she learned all of that in serving as a maid in a household in Philadelphia, and so her love of those holidays and setting tables came from. Yes, absolutely. You see the grapefruit in the picture. you know,
Yeah.
that formality that she wanted to bring back. It wasn't just for other people, it was for us. And she was so excited about those holidays and those moments. And I was always wondering, like, why are we sitting here eating grapefruit before we eat dinner? Like, why do we have to do that? But in retrospect, I understand.
Well, Lynn asked me to solicit questions from the audience around quarter of, and we're right around that spot. So why don't we see if any come in? We can keep talking if they don't, but want to open it up to anyone who's got a burning question. Are, are you planning another book besides the coffee table book? Are you?
I am. I've proposed two different projects, and I'm a person that always has like another book idea, and yet not enough time here because of all my other obligations. But I'm excited to. There's I really think of it as a second part of the book project to think about my father's generation and the generation that integrated jobs and spaces. And so I want to write about those Navy Yard stories and really sort of think about auto workers and shipyard workers and
Great.
that future generation. Because I really do think of this as my grandfather's and grandmother's story arc. But I think there's more to learn about the building of the Black middle class with working class jobs. So this
Mhm.
when in the 70s, when we have the beginnings of a substantive Black middle class, but they're all doing working class jobs. They're auto
Mhm.
workers, they're postal workers, but they build houses, they build communities, they educate their kids out of that working class existence. And so I think it's an important reminder that if we do labor correctly in this country, we don't have to have everybody turn into the CEO of something for us to
Mhm.
have an upliftment throughout society.
We have a few questions I'm reading by chat.
Great.
One of the people highlighted in the book shares the advice, be angry but not bitter, as a motivational reminder to a young man as he starts his journey west, having a sense of the challenges he would face from institutions and society. What advice would you give for today's youth as they strive towards creating a change in current inequitable systems?
I think I believe in the making sure that we have perspective on how far we've come and how close this history is. Oftentimes when I'm with my students and they're frustrated about the rate of change and what's going on, I remind them that my mother could never have attended any of the schools that I attended by law. She couldn't have worked at any of the schools that I worked at when she was a young person by law. And so in just that one generation, there is a tremendous change. And so that fight for change isn't far off. And yet we have to defend it and think about it and make it proximate to us.
Mm.
This work is not easy. It's I think that folks are now learning that we will have to defend and think about defending the changes that we build over time. They're not guaranteed. We have to keep making an argument about who we are. We have to keep studying this history and presenting it to so many different people, because I think that's a more powerful story about what this country can be than the ones that other folks would want to tell us or hide from us.
Thank you. That's great. Another question has come in, so we have at least three more, but could you please tell us more about how Black women became the backbone of household labor and the process of unionization?
So I focus just as much on women as I do on men's labor in Black folk, in part because when you look at traditional labor histories, women are largely excluded. We think of the labor of women as being outside of the spaces for organizing because they're not part of a factory floor consciousness, right? We're taught that factory floors are where things change. People get together, they whisper, they build, they have a lunch break together, they get off work together. That's where organizing really happens. It can't happen, right? Supposedly, if you are alone in a household working under supervision, you don't have that ability to organize. And so I'm flipping that on its head to say that Black women who were doing household labor, domestic labor, do have the capacity to organize. The example of the washerwoman is probably the most powerful one, that they really set the terms of the labor market based on what worked well for them. They didn't want to do laundry under the supervision of others. They wanted to do it in their own yard so that they could watch their children, tend to their own households, and really experience their freedom in a particular way. They weren't high paid people, but they set the terms of how they would do the work. And those terms were true across the entire South. And so it's a powerful reminder of their collectivity. They were the very first stay-at-home workers. What we experienced in 2020 is not the first time that people were like, hey, it would be easier for me to just not be at work and to work from here. And so those Black women really are phenomenal. And so as those next generations are migrating north, I talk about the folks who have to do household labor even after the migration, the degree to which the figure of Rosie the Riveter, it's the icon of white women entering the workforce during the Second World War. When I was looking at the numbers, I noted the boom in the number of Black women who were doing household work, in part because Rosie the Riveter had a Black maid. It enabled her to leave the household to have someone who could grocery shop, watch children, cook dinner, take care of household.
So important.
A part of the history I had never really heard anybody talk about.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Thank you for writing this collection of incredible stories that are definitely left out of traditional history books. Do you think Black folk will get a sequel of sorts, exploring even more stories amidst these neglected sources?
That's my goal. Maybe we shouldn't call it a sequel so editors want to pick it up, but I'm hooked now, and I'm excited about the number of stories that are, that still need to be told. I couldn't fit them all in one book. I had actually proposed more chapters in Black folk, and I was like, well, this is going to be too long and no one's going to read it. And I thought it had a very nice arc the way it was, but there's so much to be said, and so much of the country and so many experiences that need to be chronicled.
We have now two more. You clearly state the roots of the Black working class. What are some parallels you draw of problems that still exist today in our society?
Parallels to problems. Is that what the question was? Let me see the question.
What are some parallels you draw of problems that still exist today in our society?
Oh, one of the most striking ones was that women who, mostly women, who are doing household labor, domestic labor, caregiving, are still not protected by federal legislation about the limits on the workday, their rate of pay, overtime. They're not protected. And then so many women are working at the margins who are undocumented and really cut out and shut out of much of the protections that our country is giving other workers. And so when I was writing about the Black women who, like my grandmother, who were seeking labor in households in the Great Depression, for example, the ways in which they were abused, their rights violated over and over again because of the twists in the labor market. They called them slave markets in Bronx, where Ella Baker had written about them most famously. But those kinds of labor markets were found all over the country where people could pull up and there would be people who were willing to work for pennies on the dollar. My own grandfather had to be part of those lineups where people would barter them down to the cheapest price for their labor for the day. You can still go to Home Depots around the country and see workers who are waiting to take up day labor in those same degrading and difficult ways where they are suffer from wage theft and then certainly not protected. And so I think there's so many workers in our country today who are still suffering from the same kinds of vagaries of these marginal kinds of employments that are so difficult and it should be changed.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Professor Kelley, I'd love to hear your thoughts in light of this work on the upcoming election and how this research has shaped your thoughts on this moment in history.
Well, I am a big proponent of thinking strategically and substantively about how we put policies in place to protect the everyday person, the everyday worker, and to make sure that we are thinking about what everyday life feels like, and so that there aren't holes in the safety net. And so if you have a candidate who is interested in dismantling the existing safety net for the elderly, for the ill, for the unemployed, certainly that person would not be my candidate. I am very much interested in people who are helping us think, how do we build on it? How do we defend it? What we've already accomplished in the previous generation, what the Kennedy administration accomplished in substantive ways, what the Johnson administration accomplished in substantive ways, what FDR accomplished in substantive ways. We can't go back, for generations and dismantle those things. Those things were the buoys that society used to move out of the most awful and grating poverty for the most part. We have to defend those things. And then how do we do more? How do we think about our elderly? How do we think about our early child care? How do we think about folks who want to be entrepreneurial and stay at home and build small businesses? How do we, think about microloans for women? Who are the candidates who are doing that work? Those would be the folks that I would be wanting to vote for and to advocate for and to push. And to organize to support.
It's hard to know how to talk about our crazy political climate that we're in, which seems to change every 3 hours. But race is obviously a very important part of this election, and Biden's slipping numbers among African Americans, I think that was a factor in the growing feeling over the last few weeks that he could not win. And Kamala Harris will obviously do better. But it was very arresting when you mentioned J.D. Vance at the beginning of our conversation, because he's so clearly thinking about a completely different working class than the one you are. And yet there are critical moments in your book where white and Black working class union leaders come together meaningfully to demand change, and they help each other. And do you feel optimistic that we might do better? We've had a pretty hard racial climate going back to George Floyd and Black Lives Matter, and the Republican Party, sometimes overtly and sometimes sort of tacitly, seems to poke at those embers. Where do you think it's all going?
I think that those embers that they poke at have been quite effective for more than 100 years in terms of stoking fear, stoking resentment, and stoking a sense of competition between Black and white people in this country, and you know, the threat of the other more broadly. And it's profound to me the ways in which those same stories continue to work, even though nothing substantive is done to really elevate everyday folks on either side um, by Republicans who are now, you know, baiting, you know, so J.D. Vance saying, we're going to give you good jobs, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. How do you do that? By dismantling unions? How do you do that? By blaming the working class, as he does in his own book, for some sort of laziness and incapacity when they're whipsawed by global competition that gutted their ability to find work, that gutted their health, that gutted, you know, all the infrastructure that was there to support them. There's this wonderful book called Dying of Whiteness by Jonathan Metzl that I just adore, because it really outlines the ways in which white working people vote against their conscience, vote against their interests because they are afraid of someone else getting something. When they could be thinking about the things that they really need, and the supports that they deserve, as all Americans do. If we can get past the point of that fear button being so effective, and that sense of that whiteness is its gateway for some thing, an intangible sense of gain and benefit. If we can get past that, we'd be getting really far. And that there's been moments when we do in this country's history. There's been really important moments when we do, but they're too few and far between. So I'm hoping that Kamala's candidacy can be another one of those moments, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I worry about people's inability to really see the game that's being played.
At the beginning of the hour, Lynn mentioned the book I'm doing preliminary work on about 1968, and it is remarkable during the short-lived candidacy of Robert Kennedy how effectively he united the white and the Black working class, which has not always been easy to do, but he was really there. And it would be great if we could listen to those better angels again.
Yes,
I'm not trying to give a political message to our historical audience, but there was something unique about that campaign in 1968 that really drew a lot of very different people together.
and it was a unique moment in you know,
It was.
in time, that there was a real listening across difference and
Yes.
people learning from one another. And the work that Dr. King was also doing at the end of
Yes.
his life, you know, he was working with working class people of all backgrounds across the country. And it was, you know, my mother recalled him speaking with coal miners and saying, you know, you think you have your foot on my neck, but you're actually down in the pit with me. And so, you know, while you're so busy looking down, they've tricked you. And
Right.
so she recalled, you know, for her, that was the true threat that Dr. King had, not just dismantling, you know, the strictures on Black life around segregation, but also really questioning the power of the myth of race in subjugating us all. And so the work that RFK was doing in that same vein was so powerful and so important. It would be good to learn and to remember that again in this particular moment.
I mean, that's beautifully said. And I think that's a reason I'm drawn to this history work. And I suspect it's the same for you, is to look for heroes in the past to help us feel better about the present, where we are.
Yes, because I think the folks in the past, they were pretty amazing. You know, oftentimes the students are, you know, think little of folks who had to tolerate things that they claim they would not have wanted to tolerate, sort of, you know, in the Kanye West vein, I would never have been enslaved. And that, you know, there's a lot to admire in the ways in which those previous generations survived and built in spite of. and the power that they had in spite of the circumstances that they were in. So I'm always encouraged by these histories and by learning more about them.
Well, we're right at 2:00, and I think we promised an hour of dialogue to our listeners, and we have delivered that. But thank you for writing the book and for talking today. It was really a great experience for me, and I hope we can meet in person sometime. It'd be
Yes,
an honor.
absolutely. This has been a tremendous honor to receive this award, and I appreciate the time you all took to read, and it's a real boost for me as an author and writer, and an encouragement. So I thank you.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Blair. Thank you, Lynn.
Thank you, Lynn. You're muted.
Oh, we can't hear you, Lynn.
I just want to say thank you, Ted,